We are continuing to explore the last half of David's career. We've seen his rise, we've seen his unfortunate fall, as we've called it, and now kind of clawing back through these really painful experiences that he has, the aftermath of what occurred between David and Bathsheba and her husband Uriah. And so we find out that as a result of that, as he himself had ironically predicted, the man who did this will pay back fourfold, and David is paying back fourfold, He lost the son that he had by Bathsheba. He lost Amnon to the younger brother Absalom, and now we're seeing the run-up, of course, to the third of these sons who will finally pay with his life, partly for his own crimes, but again tracing back to what David himself had done. So last week we noted that Absalom, this son of David, had been in exile for 3 years up in a place called Geshur, the home of his mother, a princess of that kingdom. Finally, Joab was able to engineer his return, but then David grounded Absalom for 2 more years. So for 5 years, really, there had been no reconciliation. Finally, there was a kind of public restoring of the relationship, and yet it was only a half-forgiven Absalom who continued to be half-repentant for his crimes, and his bitterness toward his father was sufficient to move him to begin planning an all-out coup, a rebellion, which would involve the elimination of his father and Absalom himself taking the throne. 4 years went into this. This was not just a little momentary decision at the drop of a hat. There was a fair amount of planning that anticipated this moment, and best guess is that Ahithophel, that brilliant political advisor, had been working behind the scenes to help Absalom think this through. So last week we saw the moment when Absalom pulls the trigger, marches on Jerusalem. David hears of it, really doesn't have time to respond in any kind of credible military way. The best thing to do is just get out of town. And so those people who are loyal to him join him, and off they go, heading due east toward the Jordan, hoping to cross over and get to a more protected area. We assume that probably David left. He got the word in the morning, probably left before noon. Of course, he had to travel fairly slowly because he had people with him, including some little ones. Probably mid-afternoon, Absalom shows up with his forces, walks in. Jerusalem is abandoned by its king and the administration, so he could just kind of take over. And at this point, it seems that this was too easy, Well, we hear from David the account of his departure, that he encounters various people along the way. Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, meets him, gives him all kinds of provisions to help him on his journey, angling, I suppose, to get back some of the inheritance that David had actually more or less confiscated from him, in a sense, and given to Mephibosheth. Then we run into Shimei, this guy coming out, throwing rocks, kicking up the dirt, cursing, cussing, turning the air blue, calling David every conceivable name, because he was one of those fanatical partisans who still supported the defunct house of Saul. And then we also hear of another character, Hushai, the Archite, probably an older man, foreigner. He had sworn allegiance to David. He wanted to go with David, but David said, "No, look, I want you to go back to town. I want you to pretend loyalty to Absalom. I want you to shift teams, at least externally. But I also want you to be a double agent. I want you to slip me some intel, whatever you can learn. And I want you also, if you possibly can, to meet and hopefully overcome the good counsel that Ahithophel must be giving to Absalom right now." So it's right at that moment that we pick up the story. And so we are at this point in the halfway through chapter 16. We'll pick up there at verse 15 and continue into and finish verse 17 this morning, if all goes well. So this is 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 15, the Word of God. Now Absalom and all the Israelites came to Jerusalem. Ahithophel was with him. When Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, Hushai said to Absalom, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" Absalom said to Hushai, "So this is your loyalty to your friend? Why didn't you go with your friend?" Hushai said to Absalom, "No, but to the one whom the Lord and this people and all the Israelites have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain. Moreover, whom should I serve? Should it not be his son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you." So Hushai making a pretty good pretentious play here, and we'll see how it goes. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Our Father, we're grateful for a story that is honest to the facts of history, but also teaches us such valuable lessons. And we pray that our review of this little part of the story of this remarkable man, David, would be instructive to us. We would gain wisdom from it, that our faith would be deepened, and that in each of our hearts the name of Christ would be exalted. And it's to that end that we commit these few minutes together now in the name of Christ. Amen. So, Absalom shows up. David is gone. He's probably been on the road now for some hours. The text uses the term, the men of Israel. We're not to construe that to mean all the people of Israel, but it's those men of Israel who have become loyal to Absalom. Israel typically refers to those 10 northern tribes that have always been a little bit sort of less than enthusiastic about David anyway. The jealousy between Judah and the rest of the tribes has always been just beneath the surface, and so really that's more the focus of that particular phrase. Hushai shows up, as David had asked him, meets Absalom with these great celebrations of Absalom coming into this place. Long live the king. Probably a little flicker of suspicion flashed across the face of Absalom when he saw Hushai, who he knew to be loyal to David, showing up. But Absalom, kind of looking on the bright side, I think he probably thought, well, look at this. This proves it's all as it's supposed to be. This is a great confirmation of my plan that even Hushai would show up, this man who's been such a loyal supporter of David. Nevertheless, he puts the question to him, what about your oath? Hushai was a foreigner and had become part of the inner circle of David's advisors. But of course, in order to do that, it was necessary for Hushai to swear loyalty. We can assume that, and Absalom knew that, and so he's asking, how can you, who swore loyalty to David, so quickly and easily shift your loyalties? How does that happen exactly? So this puts Hushai to the first test of how well he can pull off this particular ruse that he's going to try to advance against Absalom. He has a two-sided plan. One of them involves just flat-out flattery. And I think he probably knows Absalom well enough to know that he's got a pretty good shot at having some influence that way. And the other part of this strategy is going to be to oversell the power of David in this circumstance. So it's kind of a carrot-stick strategy that Hushai is going to use, and we'll see that as we go along. Well, anyway, Hushai responds to the initial question this way: "No, but whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel chose, his I will be, and with him I will remain." Now, you have to say that was a model of ambiguity. Hushai, no dummy. If you put him under a lie detector test and made him sit down and answer these questions, he would pass easily, because everything he says here, he can endorse as the absolute truth. No, but whom the Lord chose. Well, who did the Lord chose? The Lord chose David. And who this people chose? Who did these people choose? They chose David. And all the men of Israel, who did they choose? They chose David. And so Hushai says, his I will be. and with him I will remain. And Hushai, of course, in his heart believes one thing while he creates an impression of something quite different in the hearing of Absalom. Furthermore, he continues, whom should I serve? Shouldn't I serve in the presence of his son? As I've served in your father's presence, so I will be in your presence. And he could say this with all conviction. Who should Hushai serve? David. Doesn't mention that. Should I not serve in the presence of his son? That is to say, serve David in the presence of his son? As I've served in your father's presence, so I will continue to serve in your presence, you know. And again, Hushai, playing it close to the vest, but it works. And so Absalom thinks, fair enough, good deal. I've got a little extra capital, a little more good advice at my disposal. Move on to the next item of business. What to do? What do we do now? We've successfully moved into Jerusalem. We find the house is vacant. We find that everything is more or less left for me to just pick up and, take over, but, what to do next. And so he turns to Ahithophel, this trusted advisor who betrays David, helps Absalom. What should we do now? Give advice. What should we do? So Ahithophel said to Absalom, go in to your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you are abhorred by your father. Then the hands of all who are with you will be strong. Ahithophel had orchestrated every detail of this so far, but you might say even now, it would have been possible to back out. Even now, as far as this had gone, Absalom could conceivably still say, whoa, I just don't know that I can go through with, theoretically. But if he does what Ahithophel has now counseled him, that is to, in effect, take as his own possession the concubines of David, then he has definitively established a point of no return. There is no going back now. There's no way for Absalom to say, oops, just kidding. At this point, it's over. For Ahithophel, for Absalom to do what he's advising at this point is, in a sense, sweet vengeance for what Ahithophel believes Absalom, or what David had done to his family in connection with Bathsheba. Moreover, if Absalom goes ahead with this, taking these concubines, then in a sense, he creates this irreversible moment that also affects all of those who are supporting Absalom. Every bridge is burned at this point. So the people that are supporting Absalom at this point have nothing left to lose. There's no way they can go back. This is like a defining cataclysm, really, an insult to David almost beyond calculation. So Absalom does that. They pitched a tent for Absalom on top of the house, David's house. And Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. This is the traditional Jewish wedding tent. It continues to this day in the canopy that's ordinarily used in Jewish weddings. This is because in the ancient world, as you know, the Jewish wedding was not followed by a honeymoon. The honeymoon took place right there. The whole celebration would last several days. They set up a tent. The newlyweds go in, and it's right there, you see. And that was the way they were celebrated. And so this is a wedding tent. And now this Absalom is more or less taking his father's cherished possessions out there in the sight of everyone. It's a public display of the most unbelievable insult, of course, to David. It makes Ahithophel an accessory to the crime. And this, of course, becomes this really dramatic moment when you'd say, there's no way to go back from here. Well, the narrator adds for us a little parenthetical comment regarding Ahithophel. Last verse of this chapter. Now, the advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. Ahithophel was widely regarded as the most brilliant political advisor of the day. He could see feints within feints. He could see the implications of actions, words stated. He knew how to parse a sentence. He knew how to play the press. He knew how to do it all. He was a brilliant tactician, and thus his counsel was held in very high esteem. Unfortunately, however, for Ahithophel, even though he retains his brilliance, he's lost his bearings. He's become, in a sense, just an old, bitter politician because of what David has done as he views it to his family, violating his granddaughter, Bathsheba. He's gone into a spiral of hatred. So while he still has the tools, the apparatus of political insight, he no longer has a very good moral compass by which he can implement those gifts. And so now, blinded by his own anger, he's giving himself to Absalom. But his advice still carries huge freight. It was as if someone would ask of the oracle of God. We've talked about the Hebrew oracle on other occasions. You know, in the ancient world, oracles were fairly common. The oracle of Delphi, you've heard of, and of course, there were many others in the ancient world. That was the most famous. There was one true oracle. The Hebrews had an oracle, and it was more or less in the possession of the priest who had those strange gemstones, the Urim and the Thummim. And people in high office, especially the king, could go to the oracle and typically pose yes or no questions and get responses. And we've seen that, of course, used throughout the story that we've seen concerning David all the way through. Well, if you couldn't afford the oracle, however, you could just go ask Ahithophel. And basically his counsel was viewed as being pretty much on a par, that he had that much just native insight that he could compete with the oracle for the credibility and believability of his counsel. So anyway, that's the first little stage of the strategy. The concubines have now been co-opted by Absalom. We come to chapter 17. And Ahithophel continues to give counsel. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Now let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight." 12,000 is a sizable force, but these would be military types. They could move fairly rapidly. David had probably left Jerusalem, just within an hour or two of getting this information about Absalom on the march. He'd probably left mid-morning, was well on his way to the fords of the Jordan. Under ordinary circumstances, with the kind of the crowd that was with him, the people that were with him, including some animals, some young ones, they would probably get to the Jordan about midnight. Ahithophel, if he had 12,000 troops in a forced march, leaving even mid-afternoon, could get there about the same time. If he had succeeded in this plan, by every ordinary human measure, he would have been successful. David would have been defeated. That's the view of the narrator, as we're going to see. That's typically been the view of the reviewers of this from a military perspective. This seems to be pretty much a open and shut strategy, that if he can get 12,000 people and go out in hot pursuit, there's no possible way that David is going to be able to survive it, barring divine intervention. Ahithophel explains his strategy in some detail. "I will come upon him while he is weary and weak. I'll make him afraid. All the people who are with him will flee, and I will strike, as in a surgical strike, only the king. Then I'll bring back all the people to you. When all return except the man who you seek, all the people will be at peace." Well, it was true enough. This had been a long day for David. And of course, all that he'd gone through, the grief he sustained, just the experience of facing the assault of his own son, Shimei, all of these other matters, by the end of the day, by the time he reached the Jordan, he was certainly going to be weak and weary, to say the least. You might think that Absalom would have a little twinge of sympathy for his old man, given that particular description, but nothing like that seems to come to the surface. Ahithophel says, I will take out only David. We will take him without any other collateral damage to the extent we possibly can. And of course, once that happens, what's to fight for? These who have rallied to support the king will no longer have a cause to justify an ongoing conflict. They would be forced, as a practical matter, to acknowledge Absalom as the successor. This kind of coup in the ancient Near East was not all that uncommon. And as a matter of course, it would typically be the one who had successfully raised this rebellion who would then become the next king. The man who you seek, Ahithophel politely avoids giving the name David here. The man who you seek is going to be taken out of the picture. And Absalom thought, not bad. Not a bad plan. And those who were advising Absalom and heard Ahithophel's strategy thought, sounds like it might work. So all of these who had resented David and were looking for a quick end to this conflict thought, Ahithophel's got a pretty good plan in play. Well, Absalom was probably just about to say, okay, do it, when he remembered, well, there is that Hushai guy, and he's not bad in strategic planning as well. He's got a military background. He might have an interesting take. If he agrees with Ahithophel, then good, but let's see what he thinks. So call Hushai the Archite, and let's also hear what he says. When Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom spoke to him, saying, now look, Ahithophel said we should do this. Should we? What do you think? Speak up. What do you think? So Hushai said to Absalom, well, the advice that Ahithophel has given is not good at this time. Maybe later. Well, this was just what David was hoping for, of course. This was the whole reason that David had sent Hushai back to Jerusalem. He knew that Ahithophel was going to have extremely good counsel, and he's hoping he can blow a little smoke into the machinery through Hushai. So Hushai, as I mentioned earlier, advises delay, and he's got a two-part argument. One, buttering up Absalom. The other, embellishing David and his reputation. The phrase here that Hushai gave, the advice that Ahithophel has given is not good at this time, is one way to read the Hebrew there. The other, and some commentators note that the Hebrew could also be construed as, this time his advice is not good. It's a little ambiguous, it could go either way, and each of them has a different sense to it. The one simply suggests that, well, yeah, it's a good plan, but it's not quite time to do it yet, The other is that, yeah, Ahithophel has given good advice, but not on this one, as if to say, the advice of Ahithophel to go into the concubines, that was a good plan, but, this surgical strike against David, that may not work so well. And so you can take it either way you want. Either way, it comes out about the same. So first of all, Hushai is going to paint a picture of David. You know your father, Absalom, and you know his men. They are mighty men. And they are enraged in their minds, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Your father is a man of war. He's not going to camp with the people. Remember who your father is, Absalom? He's the guy that killed Goliath. Remember him? He's the guy that has struck the Philistines repeatedly with a mighty blow. Remember him? That's the man you're dealing with here. Let's not underestimate this character who is your father. And those who are with him, they are mighty men of valor. They are battle-hardened individuals who know exactly what to do on the battlefield. And you think you can just come swooping in there and take him out. Ain't going to be so easy, Absalom. Even now, he's probably hidden in some pit or some other place. And you know what's going to happen? It'll be when some of them are overthrown at the first, when there's the first skirmish, when there's the first bloodshed. There's going to be some casualties. David's men may sustain some casualties, but so will yours. But keep in mind that when people hear of these casualties, it's going to be all over the internet. the slaughter among the people that follow Absalom. Why? Because nobody thinks you can take on David successfully. And they're going to immediately construe this whole thing against you. The king is going to be hiding somewhere. You're going to have to go looking for him. That's going to give rise to all kinds of conflicts, skirmishes, bloodshed. He's surrounded by people who are competent warriors. This bloodshed is going to lead to an impression that you're losing. And when that word comes back, when the word comes back, Absalom, that the people who have gone out to fight on your behalf are losing, even if it's just losing slightly, it's going to be exaggerated in the minds of those who hear it, so that even he who is valiant, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt. We're losing. It's all over. Because all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. And Absalom thinks to himself, yeah, now that you mention it. And so the plausibility of what Hushai has just suggested gives him a little bit of hesitancy. That's part A of Hushai's argument. Now we move to part B, which is pure, straight-up flattery. So, Absalom, here's my advice. You should wait until all Israel is gathered to you, because the subtext here, because you know everybody loves you. So wait until everyone from Dan to Beersheba, north to south, the entire country, has amassed itself behind you, like the sand that's on the sea for multitude. And then, Absalom, you should go into battle in person. Now that's kind of a glorious picture that Absalom begins to paint in his mind. This wonderful kingly character out in front on a white horse with massive numbers of people behind. Absalom likes that action. He thinks that might, be kind of a fun way to play this thing. So he's an appeal to his vanity, suggesting his presence on the battlefield would inspire valor among all of these massive numbers of warriors who would be behind him. So, Hushai continues, we'll come upon him in some place where he may be found, even if he's hiding. Because you see, we're going to fall on him as the dew falls on the ground. And of him and all the men who are with him, there shall not be so much as one left. The idea of dew on the ground, overwhelming force, just a complete coverage. We're going to come with such an amazing, amassed army. Who could possibly resist? We're going to take out everybody, including David and all of those who are aligned with him. Now, let's say David runs into a city, Hushai says, and is hiding out there, safe inside an impregnable city. Then what will we do then? Hushai says, look, if he's withdrawn into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we'll pull that city right into the river, and there won't be one stone left. That's a pretty good trick, But again, it's just this hyperbole of irresistible power that is going to be at the disposal of Absalom, such that not a trace of David or his followers would be left. So now we've got the carrot and the stick. The stick, David is a scary guy. The carrot, you're such a great guy, Absalom. Wouldn't it be great to have this kind of glorious moment in the midst of this rebellion that you're participating in? Well, Hushai is dismissed. Absalom goes into privy council and begins to talk it over. And so Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is actually better than the advice of Ahithophel. And then the narrator adds a little personal perspective, because the Lord had purposed to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel to the intent that the Lord might bring disaster on Absalom. Obviously, the narrator here, the storyteller, we don't know who it is, by the way, but whoever it was, believed Ahithophel had the right answer. And if Absalom had gone with Ahithophel's plan, all things being equal, would have been curtains for David. But God had something different in mind, and because of that, we find Absalom swayed, not by good judgment, but by the exaggerated picture of David and the appeal to his own ego. And so, it's going to be Hushai that wins the day. One commentator musing on this made this comment. He said, in the final analysis, Absalom did not have the courage to pull the trigger. He was not sure of his own hold on the people, of the righteousness of his cause, or of the ingenuity of his father. It all caused him to hesitate, and in that he lost. Irresolution defeated Absalom. As Hitler's invasion of Russia instead of Britain brought about his defeat. This was, by the way, written by a British commentator, so he has that in his head. Self-interest motivates, but is not good at advising what is the best course. And the last line of this quote is worth the price of admission. Right here, listen to this. Self-interest always reaches the point where it cannot answer the question, what is in my self-interest? A person that lives his life or her life on the premise of doing what is in my own self-interest, always serving myself, always pursuing that course, which is most likely to be good for me, will eventually get lost in a fog that can become utterly self-destructive. Jesus says if a man seeks to get his life, to keep it, to hang on to it, he'll lose it. The life which is going to be a life of success, of well-being, of blessing, is a life in which the primary motive that gets me out of bed in the morning is how can I do something good for someone else? How can I serve the person next to me? How can I be a good neighbor to my neighbor? How can I even do good for my enemy? And in so doing, Jesus says, as I apparently lose my life, I capture it. I get it back. Unfortunately, Absalom had never read that Bible verse, and so he took the course of pure self-interest. Well, Hushai, as I say, was dismissed. He didn't know which way Absalom was going to go. And so out he goes, and he has to assume the worst, even though he's made a good argument and hopes he's been successful, hoped he hit the target. For all he knows, Ahithophel wins the day, and this 12,000-man force is going to go out. So Hushai immediately, surreptitiously, sneaks off and finds the two priests who are the insiders within Jerusalem. And he passes on to them what's just happened. Thus and so Ahithophel advised Absalom and the elders, and thus and so I have advised, so look. Send quickly and tell David, saying, don't spend the night in the plains of the wilderness, meaning the fords of the Jordan, but speedily cross over, lest the king and all the people who are with him are swallowed up. So Hushai assumes the worst. David, he knows, is eventually pretty soon going to reach that fords. He's going to be exhausted from a long day of travel and crossing the river, even where the water's a little lower, the ford's there so you can kind of wade across, but it's still quite an arduous project, especially with everything they have. And David might be tempted to just hold out until morning light. And Hushai knows that if Ahithophel wins the day, it's going to be curtains. So he says, even though you're tired, cross the Jordan. You'll have the protection of that river between you. So, fearing the worst, he gives that counsel. Well, the couriers for this information are the two sons of the two priests, Jonathan and Ahimaaz. We've met them before. They are at a place called En Rogel, which is just outside Jerusalem, because they dared not be seen coming into the city. The priests wouldn't be necessarily suspected, but these two sons, younger, fleet of foot, might raise some suspicion. And so they're staying out of sight. And a female servant would come out and tell them, because that was women's work in those days, I think you know that, getting the water from the well. So they'd go out. This was a routine task. And they would go out and get the water, and she was going to be the secret courier of the information from the priest, delivering it to these guys, who are then going to take off off to the river in order to deliver that intel to David. In Rogel is a known location. It was called the Fuller's Spring later, and finally it's called Job's Well, which is just outside of Jerusalem. Seems to be the place. And so that's where these guys are, hiding out to avoid suspicion. This is stated to us as if it were an ongoing program, and it was, but of course this was the first time it had been tested. So we're dealing with the first time this particular mode of communication was actually run up the flagpole here. So she goes out to get water, ostensibly, and she's going to tell the information to these two. Well, as it turns out, the first time out of the chutes it didn't work so well. A lad saw them and told Absalom. Isn't this just like made for movies? I'll tell you. And both of them went away quickly and came to a man's house in, of all places, Bahurim. Who was from Bahurim? Remember last week, Shimei, the guy that came out cussing and giving David on. Well, now we know not everybody in that city shared the sentiments of our friend Shimei. So he goes, they wind up at the same little town, Bahurim, about 4 miles out of Jerusalem. This individual had a well in his court. And these two guys just dive headfirst right into that well. Well, the lad sounds like a boy, and it could have been, but actually the Hebrew word there could also mean a young man, and it may actually be someone who was serving Absalom, something like a bodyguard. Absalom was probably concerned about information getting to David. He knew which direction he'd gone, and so he was probably watching for something like this. He wanted to cut off that particular source of information. And so these two guys get to Bahurim, dive into the well, the home of Shimei, as we were saying, but obviously not everybody shared his hostility to David. Then the woman, matron of the house, took and spread a covering over the well's mouth and spread ground grain on it, and the thing was not known. The well would typically be covered to keep debris from falling in. She puts kind of this flat covering over it, and then she throws out a bunch of stuff looking like she's husking grain, that kind of thing, like it's been there for a while. And so they're hiding down in this well. And when Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house, they said, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" They probably banged on doors all over the little town till they finally came to her place. She said, "Oh, I just saw them. They've gone over the water brook. Get after them, you'll catch them." And so they took off. The guys are still in the well. They go out on this wild goose chase looking for Ahimaaz and Jonathan. Not successful. They finally return, go back to Jerusalem. The little brook there seems to be one that would actually be in the direction of the Jordan, but obviously they weren't there to be found. So the men stayed hidden, and the men stayed hidden with the protection of this woman who was just apparently minding her business on this occasion. Commentator was again noting how often have victories been won in large measure based on the valiant efforts of a brave underground. David's success depended on Hushai, Abiathar, Zadok, Jonathan, Ahimaaz, and an unnamed woman. The work of Christ in this world requires both those up front and also the faithful underground. Some of you may know that the great preacher Charles Spurgeon in 19th century England, who could preach with such powerful effect on thousands of people, he was a phenomenon of his day. And people wondered how it was that he could have that in him. He was a great preacher, but it seemed that his effect on people was just beyond any normal expectation. On one occasion, someone from the press asked him how it was that he could have such effect, and he simply took them downstairs before he was about to preach and showed them a little room in the basement of the church. Opened the door, and there were 50 people on their knees praying. He congratulated himself that he was so eloquent or persuasive, but realized from whence his power must come. I've thought that wouldn't be a bad strategy around here, would it? You know, we should probably have a little cell of prayers every time we have a church service, people who are praying to the effect of the work of God in our services. We might be pleased at the effect that that would have. Now it came to pass after they had departed these guys from Absalom, that they came up out of the well and went and told King David and said to David, "Arise, cross over the water quickly, for thus Ahithophel is advised against you." So David and all the people who were with him arose, didn't like the idea much, but what are you going to do? This is it. It's dark already. It's probably around midnight, so it's an all-nighter. Crossing over the Jordan. By morning light, not one of them was left who had gone over the Jordan. David, of course, recognized the danger. He didn't know, but what there might be the sound of hoofbeats, coming along pretty quickly. So he wanted to cross over and get at least that kind of protection between him and threatening forces. Ahithophel, we don't know when this happened. It's presumably later, maybe some days later. When Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he saddled a donkey, arose and went to his home, to his house, a place called Gilo, about 15 miles away, to his city. He put his household in order and hanged himself, and died, and he was buried in his father's tomb. The parallel between Ahithophel and Judas has, of course, been noted by virtually every commentator on this text. Ahithophel betrays David. Judas betrayed the son of David. Both of them seem to have had a dreadful epiphany at some point as to what they had done, and both of them can no longer bear the pain of that understanding and put an end to their own lives. Ahithophel, for his part, knew that the coup that he had helped engineer was risky at best, and now he knew that his advice had not been taken. It would certainly be doomed. He knew he would die a traitor, and he preferred to die at his own hand rather than at the hand of an executioner. So, regardless of how David was going to treat Absalom, Ahithophel knew that this was the certain outcome for him. One commentator said Ahithophel should have trusted the axiom, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." Ahithophel was driven by anger, and though he was brilliant, his anger became misdirected and, of course, ultimately, in a dramatic sort of way, self-destructive. Ahithophel knew that when Absalom accepted his counsel as to the concubines, but declined his counsel as to the attack, it doomed him. Some time passes. David went to Mahanaim. Absalom crossed over. Now we can assume this was probably a month later or so. We're not told that, but it would take probably that long for everything that we hear of now to take place. Absalom crossed over the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. Now Mahanaim is right there if you can see it. It would be from the crossover place, the fords of the Jordan, down about 4 miles north of the Dead Sea, and then about 50 miles north would bring you to this fortified city. This was actually the city where Ishbosheth, if you remember him, the son of Saul, who had been a competing ruler over Israel for a time when David was ruling in Judah, he was ruling over the other tribes from Mahanaim. So that's this location. So Absalom has waited around in Jerusalem. He's gone through, apparently, we gather from other places, some ceremonies. He's had himself anointed king. He's been crowned. He's had a celebration. He's had a big ball, and all of this has gone on. Meantime, David is having an opportunity to prepare. So Absalom, now that we reach the point that he feels like he has at least a sufficient military force to carry out the attack on David, appointed a captain whose name was Amasa, to take the place of Joab, who of course is still sided with David. And then we have one of the most interesting, confusing verses in the whole text. So if you want to stand up and explain it to all of us, then more power to you. Here it comes. This Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Jithra, an Israelite, which probably should be Ishmaelite. That's a textual error there. Jithra, an Ishmaelite, who had gone into Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, the sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. Now do a family tree on that one. The problem is, and I tried, and there are some loose ends here that just don't quite add up. And as I was consulting commentaries and so on, the problem is, who in the world is Nahash? You know, who is this person? The identity is somewhat disputed and somewhat uncertain. The two most likely theories are that Nahash is the wife of Jesse, who's never mentioned by name. The problem is Nahash is a man's name. And so that seems to have it's not inconceivable, but it's at least unlikely. The other is that David's mother had been married before she married Jesse, and that her first husband was named Nahash. But my question to you is, do you care? So, if this is a perplexing problem, then you go work on it and bring me word again what you come up with, but we're going to leave that behind. Anyway, Amasa, we're just going to leave it at this, is a shirt-tail relative of David and Joab and the family, and what it is beyond that remains a bit of a mystery. So Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. Now there's Mahanaim. Gilead is a little bit to the south, so they've crossed over and they've arrayed in their battle formation, anticipating this conflict between the two. Interestingly, and I'm going to conclude on this thought, the most powerful chieftains, tribal leaders, elders in that region sided with David, even though in some ways you might think he was in the territory that was loyal to Saul. Three of these are especially mentioned at this point. When David had come to Mahanaim, we have Shobi, the son of Nahash, by the way, a different Nahash, just to keep your attention, from Rabbah of the people of Ammon. Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lodebar. Barzillai, the Gileonite, from Regolim. Oh, who are these people? Shobi is the younger brother of Hanun. Now, I know your eyes are glazing over, but hang on to this. Nahash had been the king of Ammon and had been an ally of David. David and Nahash, the king of Ammon, had a treaty. He died. His son Hanun took the throne, and he was the one that insulted the emissaries of David when he'd sent them. You remember that story? We looked at that some time back. That's what precipitated the war between Israel and Ammon, in which Ammon lost big time. But after it was all over, David appointed the younger son of Hanun, who had died by then, whose name was Shobi, and appointed him king over Ammon and a vice-regent acting on behalf of David. So actually, when David could have just destroyed Ammon, he actually allowed them to continue and to have a certain degree of independence, and he put this younger son there in control. So in a sense, Shobi is paying back debts now at this point to side with David. Machir is the one who had offered asylum and protection to Mephibosheth before David had invited him in to be a guest at the king's table. Machir was always impressed with David. That act of benevolence toward Mephibosheth, who David could have just executed as a claimant to the throne, impressed him so much that he became a strong supporter of David. Barzillai, we know less about him, but we have a sense that David had also done good things for him. So the point is, all of these people, though they were in a place where you might have expected the natural disposition to be hostile to David, because David had shown them kindness when he didn't have to, when he was in a position of strength earlier, they didn't forget. They took notes on that. And now when David is the one in stress, they come around and begin to provide for him. So they brought beds and basins, earthen vessels and wheat, barley and flour, parched grain and beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey and curds. I don't know what half this stuff is. Sheep and cheese for the herd, and David and all who were with them to eat, for they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty from the wilderness. Beds to sleep on, basins for cooking and washing, parched corn, staple product of the day. Sheep was the standard meat that you would eat in that day. One commentator musing on this in summary, past generosity on David's part won him kind treatment now. Loyalty to a good leader may unite people from widely varying backgrounds otherwise. The greatest example is Jesus, who unites people from every nation, tribe, language, and people. I love that verse. That is repeated, that phrase, every nation, tribe, language, and people, is repeated 7 times in the book of Revelation, which we're going to study next fall. You know that. Verse by verse study of Revelation. We're going to come into that phrase again and again. All right, well, Sunday school lesson for the morning. Number 1, our best friends and advisors are seldom those who speak sweet-sounding lies. Now, I'm going to be honest. I like hearing sweet-sounding lies occasionally, you know. So I'm not making this an absolute prohibition. My wife tells me sweet-sounding lies all the time. I know it's not the truth, but, you know, she just knows how to kind of pump me full of sunshine when I need it. So I'm saying our best friends and advisors are seldom those who speak sweet-sounding lies, but who speak the truth in love, who are more interested in telling us what we need to hear than what we want to hear, but doing it in love. Paul's admonition, speak the truth in love. That's the kind of friends we need to have. That's the kind of friend we need to be. Someone who doesn't flatter the way that Hushai was buttering up Absalom, leading him to his own destruction, but rather someone who speaks the truth. That's the true call of a Christian ethic. Second, our best service in the cause of Christ is seldom visible publicly, but rather it is behind the scenes as we join Christ's underground, knowing that the Father who sees in secret will reward openly. You look at church history, and you know that there's some famous people. You got your Martin Luther, John Calvin, Augustine, Aquinas, etc. These are big names. But do you know what? There are literally millions upon millions upon millions of people whose names we have never heard and never will hear this side of eternity, who are the real backbone of what God has done, building His kingdom in the history of the Christian movement. Many of us in this room will not even be heard of once we've been dead 50 years, you know? People won't even have heard of us. Does that mean our lives are insignificant? Heavens no. Because those people who have never heard of us are living lives built on a foundation that we helped lay. And thus we should live for generations into the future, knowing that while our name may get lost, you know, along the way, that doesn't matter so much. God remembers our names, and that's what really matters. And so this story is a story of an underground, people who were working in the shadows to nevertheless accomplish important things. And finally, our best investment in our own well-being is seldom in stocks and bonds, hedge funds, you know, real estate, whatever. Not that those are bad investments, I'm saying, but our best investments are in lives. Lives. Because as we generously care for those in need, we, as Solomon says in Proverbs, lend to the Lord, and He always pays His debts. And so when we look for opportunities to serve, we should look for opportunities, especially those who are in no position to repay, those in true need, as David did toward Mephibosheth and David did toward many others. When he was in a position of strength, generously doing more than he needed to, and now in his position of desperate need, God repaid. And in our lives, I think all of us can cite times when we've seen something like that as well. So it's hopefully a good... Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Our Father, we're grateful. We're grateful for authentic personalities that teach us so much, both about life, about the human heart and its brokenness, but also teach us about your grace and your faithfulness and your justice in the way that you run this world. And we thank you we've had an opportunity to review this text. We thank you for the lessons we learned from it. We pray that by your Spirit we would apply these as needed and as relevant in each of our lives, that we might be more fully devoted to Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.